My dad burst out at family reunion. I'm proud of all my children, except the loser. I left but. I never imagined the worst moment of my life would happen while holding a champagne flute at a rooftop family reunion in downtown Chicago. There were string lights overhead, classical music playing softly, and over 40 guests dressed in pastel linen, like we were filming some kind of tasteful commercial for Legacy. I had spent the week rehearsing what I would say when my father finally looked me in the eye, finally asked something about my work. Instead, he raised his glass, scanned the room with calculated warmth, and said, "I'm proud of all my children." He paused just long enough for me to feel that old hope flicker in my chest before he added, "Except the loser." At first, I wasn't even sure I heard him right. Then the half-laughs came awkward and scattered, and I felt the silence swell in the space where my name should have lived. That's how I left the reunion. Not in anger, not in tears. Just calmly, deliberately, without another word. My name is Bethany Moda. I'm 33 years old, born and raised in Chicago, but I live in Seattle now. I'm a publishing strategist, or I was. Until last year, I was the creative director and co-founder of a digital imprint called Bookmint. We gave independent writers a way to publish without being filtered out by old money and old rules. The idea was mine. I built it from a laptop in a studio apartment with no heat-borrowed server space and ramen-stained hoodies. The brand grew fast. Maybe too fast. A larger company bought us out 6 months ago, absorbed our tech, absorbed our talent, and erased my name from every press release. That company was Franklin's Imprint. That name might not mean much to most people, but Franklin is my father. Franklin Moda built one of the largest publishing houses in the country. He started with niche academic textbooks and slowly expanded into digital platforms, exclusive author deals, and a university fellowship program that now bears his name. If you walk through the main building of his company in downtown Chicago, you'll see portraits of every department head, most of whom are either family or lifelong associates. You won't see me, not because I didn't try. I did more times than I can count. Internships, strategy pitches, joint ventures. I once flew across the country for a 10-minute coffee he canceled last minute. When Bookmint started getting press, he told people it was a cute side project. That rooftop reunion wasn't supposed to be a battleground. I wore a navy sheath dress my mother once complimented, carried a bottle of wine from a vineyard I knew my father liked. I had brought a monogrammed fountain pen in a velvet box engraved with the year his company acquired Bookmint. I planned to give it to him as a symbolic truce, a gesture that maybe now we could finally talk as equals. I spent the Uber ride rehearsing a line I never got to say. When he made that toast, I didn't flinch. I didn't laugh. I set my glass down and walked past tables full of people who had once told me I had promise. No one stopped me. I didn't go back for the gift. I didn't even call a ride. I just walked 6 blocks in those painful heels until my feet bled. That was the moment something shifted. Not suddenly, but completely. That moment wasn't just about humiliation. It was about clarity. It wasn't the first time he had ignored me in front of others, or reframed my success as luck or nepotism, but it was the first time I realized how comfortable he had become doing it publicly. It wasn't about me failing. It was about him needing me to stay small. I checked into a hotel that night. I told myself I would sleep and let it pass, but I couldn't. Something in me kept repeating his words like a riddle with an answer I had missed. I opened my laptop at 3 a.m. and typed one sentence. What if I stopped trying to be one of his children? I stared at that sentence for almost an hour. Then I started opening old files, legal documents from the acquisition press, coverage emails I'd buried from attorneys who said I had a case if I wanted one. But more than anything, I started thinking about a storage box in my closet at home. Inside it was something I had never dared open, given to me by my mother 6 years ago after a minor surgery. She said it was just some old documents. I never looked. But now I wasn't so sure, because there was something about the way she'd looked at me that night, like she wanted to say something but couldn't. And suddenly, I needed to know why. It took me a full day before I flew back to Seattle. The reunion ended in silence for me, but apparently not for everyone else. My cousin called to say people were whispering about my exit like it had been some dramatic tantrum. I let her talk and said nothing. At the airport, I kept to myself earbuds and sunglasses on, but even in the crowded terminal, I kept replaying his words in my head. Not the toast. Not the loser line. The part from years ago, the one he said after the Bookmint acquisition, "You're lucky I stepped in before you embarrassed the family further." At the time, I thought it was just his usual condescension. But something about it didn't sit right anymore. Because if I had failed, why take the company? Why fold it into his own, if it wasn't worth something? And why erase me completely, as if my name being associated with it would taint his legacy? By the time I landed back in Seattle, I already knew I wasn't going to let it go. I didn't have a grand plan yet, just an ache in my chest that told me this time I couldn't walk away quietly. My apartment was still exactly as I left it, half-folded laundry on the couch, a single wine glass in the sink. But when I saw the storage bin in the back of my closet, something clicked. My mother had handed it to me the day after I'd been released from the hospital for a minor surgery. She said it was old paperwork, family records, my birth certificate, medical notes. I had shoved it into the closet and never looked. At the time, I thought she was just being sentimental. But now, as I opened the lid and sifted through the yellowing folders and hospital forms, I realized she had left something else inside. My original birth certificate was clipped to a stack of insurance records. At first glance, nothing seemed odd. My name, my mother's name. But the line where my father's name should have been was blank. No signature. No mention of Franklin. I flipped through more pages, each one older than the last, until I found a handwritten letter folded behind a lab report. The letter was dated 6 weeks before my parents' wedding. It was from someone named Adrian Lane. The handwriting was neat but emotional, like someone trying to sound formal but failing. He wrote about a trip they took to Cape Cod, about a decision she had made, about not telling Franklin anything. My hands started shaking, not from fear, from something older, deeper. Like my body had known this was coming all along. I Googled Adrian Lane. There wasn't much at first. But eventually, I found a small bio on an alumni page. Professor of Comparative Literature, Columbia University. No photos. Just a name, an address, and a short quote about his passion for early American poetry. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the city sounds outside my window, and trying to understand how this changed everything. Or maybe it didn't change anything at all. Maybe it only confirmed what I had always felt. That I didn't fit into my family not because I failed them, but because I was never really part of the mold. That the sharp looks, the constant coldness, the need to discipline me into shape had been less about behavior and more about biology. My father's rejection hadn't been earned. It had been inevitable. The next morning, I called Darren. He was the only person from the old Bookmint team I still trusted. We had started together in grad school, built the platform with late-night coding sessions and unpaid internships and barely legal caffeine habits. He had stayed on after the acquisition, taken a management role in the design team under Franklin's new publishing division. When he picked up, I didn't even say hello. I just asked, "Do you still have the pre-acquisition archive?" He paused. Then said, "You mean the one legal told us to destroy?" I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "Yeah," he said. "I saved a copy. I figured someday you'd ask." I didn't tell him why I was asking. Not yet. I just asked if we could meet. We sat in a quiet booth in an old diner near Capitol Hill. It was the kind of place that served coffee in chipped ceramic mugs and didn't rush you out. Darren looked older than I remembered, the last few years having clearly aged him, but he still had the same nervous energy. He handed me a flash drive under the table, like we were passing secrets, and in a way we were. I asked him one more question before we left. "When they took Bookmint," I said, "did Franklin ever mention me by name?" Darren shook his head. "Not once. Just called you the girl who got lucky." I nodded. That was all I needed to know. That afternoon, I booked an appointment with a lawyer. Not to sue. Not yet. Just to ask questions. Copyrights, asset history, founders' agreements. I handed over the letter, the birth certificate, the flash drive, and asked what was possible. The lawyer was a woman named Yvette Saunders. Calm. Brilliant. The kind of person who didn't flinch at family drama or corporate betrayal. She didn't say much. Just took notes, asked a few clarifying questions, then leaned back and said, "If this all checks out, they stole more than your company. They stole your name." And that was the first time it occurred to me that maybe this wasn't just about revenge. Maybe it was about something more essential: reclamation. Not just of credit, but of identity. And maybe if I was willing to keep digging, I could find out just how deep the erasure had gone. Yvette's words stayed with me for days. She didn't push. She didn't romanticize my story. She just laid out the facts like pieces of a larger equation. If the flash drive proved I was a founding strategist of Bookmint, and if the letter confirmed Franklin was never my legal father, then everything that had been taken from me could in theory be reclaimed. She made it clear the process would be long and public, and some parts would hurt more than I expected. But what surprised me most was how calm I felt. Not angry, not even afraid, just ready, as if something inside me had quietly been waiting for this green light to move forward. I spent that week combing through every document from the flash drive. Contracts I had signed, early investor decks with my name listed as co-founder, internal memos that referenced my market projections, platform algorithms, and content strategy. It was all there, buried under years of edits and version histories. There were even drafts of press releases where my name had been replaced at the last minute before publication. They hadn't erased me accidentally. They had done it deliberately with intent. In legal terms, it was called misrepresentation of authorship. In human terms, it felt more like theft of self. What broke something in me wasn't the paperwork. It was a short video clip, buried in a 2019 folder labeled Team Retreat. I clicked play not knowing what to expect, and there I was sitting in a folding chair in a cabin in Oregon, explaining to the small team how our publishing algorithm could prioritize marginalized voices without sacrificing revenue. I looked younger, tired, but alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. The team had applauded. I had laughed. It was such a small moment, yet watching it brought tears to my eyes. Not because I missed that version of myself, but because I realized how far I had drifted from her. I called my mother 3 days later. She didn't pick up. I didn't leave a message. Instead, I wrote her a letter. Not an angry one, not an accusation, just questions. I asked her how long she had known, why she had never said anything, whether Adrian Lane ever knew about me. I didn't expect an answer, but writing it helped me clarify what I needed to do next. I booked a flight back to Chicago, not to see her, not yet, but to attend an event Franklin had been planning for months. The Franklin Imprint Next Chapter Gala was being held at the Chicago Public Library, a massive glass and marble space that seemed too large for anything personal. But Franklin never did personal. He did performance. This event was the launch of his new digital publishing platform, a direct evolution of the Bookmint tech stack. The entire evening was branded as his innovation. Invitations had gone out to editors, authors, media outlets, and even politicians. I hadn't been invited, of course, but I didn't need a formal pass. I had already arranged access through a friend in production, and more importantly, I didn't plan to attend as a guest. Yvette helped me prepare a legal packet. It wasn't a lawsuit. Not yet. But it included a formal public ownership claim, internal documentation of my contributions, and a brief statement of authorship. I wasn't going to shout or scream. I just wanted the truth printed on paper and handed to the very people he had convinced otherwise. I made sure a copy was delivered to the press kit table, and another to the event coordinator. I also made sure that the envelope bearing my name was gold embossed. Not for drama. Just to make it unmistakably clear. I arrived at the gala wearing black. Not out of mourning. Just to be invisible. I watched from the back of the room as Franklin took the stage, polished as ever in a tailored suit, smiling like a man who had never told a lie. He thanked his team, he thanked his children. He even mentioned David and Clara by name. Not me, never me. The presentation opened with a video montage of legacy moments, including footage from recent acquisitions. When the Bookmint slide appeared, my name was nowhere to be found. Just the company logo and the phrase "Vision made real by Franklin's leadership." That was when I knew I'd made the right choice. I didn't want his apology anymore. I didn't even need his recognition. I just wanted the people watching to know that story wasn't true. And one by one they would. Because when the press kits were opened and my statement was read, the silence that followed would be louder than any applause he had earned that night. I didn't wait for the press fallout. I returned to Seattle the next morning, sat on my balcony with black coffee, and let the quiet do what it needed to. For the first time in years, I didn't check work emails. I didn't open my calendar. I didn't try to reframe what had happened or wonder how he'd spin it. I just let the facts sit there between us like a line finally drawn. I wasn't interested in revenge. What I wanted now was clarity. And from the way Yvette phrased it, clarity was exactly what the industry was about to get. 3 days after the gala, a trade journal published a quiet story tucked halfway through its digital issue. It wasn't a hit piece. Just an outline of the legal documentation I had submitted, confirming that the tech stack used by Franklin's new digital platform had been developed under a company I co-founded. They quoted my name once, attributed me as former strategist and architect of Bookmint's original growth model. It was only 2 paragraphs. But that small ripple started a shift I hadn't expected. My inbox began filling with messages, not from family, but from former clients, developers, and writers I had helped years ago. Some just wrote, "I knew it." Others asked if I was starting something new. A few sent old screenshots of my early newsletters with subject lines I'd forgotten I'd written, and somehow all of it meant more than anything Franklin had ever withheld. My mother called once. I didn't pick up. She didn't leave a voicemail. The silence between us was still too loud to cross. I knew she wasn't the enemy. But her passivity had cost me too much to pretend we could rewind. I did, however, reach out to Adrian Lane. I kept the message short. I told him who I was when I was born, and where my mother had been that year. I attached a copy of the letter I had found, and said he didn't owe me anything but I had questions, and if he wanted to talk I was open. I didn't expect anything. So when his reply came less than 12 hours later, I read it 3 times before responding. He said he remembered her, said he had always wondered what might have happened, that they had ended things under pressure from both families, and he'd never heard from her again. He didn't confirm anything outright, but he asked if we could meet. He was visiting Seattle the following week for a lecture series. I said yes, then immediately shut my laptop and walked to the nearest park because I wasn't ready to feel what I was feeling. This wasn't about replacing one father with another. It was about answering something my DNA had been quietly carrying for years. A question about why I never felt safe in the house where I grew up. Why love always felt like something I had to earn, and even then never fully received. The night before we met, I couldn't sleep. I laid out 4 different outfits, none of which felt right. Eventually, I chose jeans and a plain sweater. Nothing performative, nothing trying too hard. I met him at a cafe near the university, and the first thing he said when he saw me was, "You have her eyes. Not a test, not a demand, just a fact." We talked for 2 hours. About books, about architecture. About what it felt like to be someone who never quite belonged to the circles they were pushed into. He didn't ask for anything. He didn't try to insert himself into my life. But when we parted, he said, "You've done something beautiful even with the silence they gave you. That matters." That night, I wrote the first paragraph of something I hadn't been able to write in years. A new idea, a new platform, one not built for approval or profit or family legacy, one built for women like me. For people who had been erased or misnamed or silenced inside systems that only recognized value through inheritance. I didn't tell anyone yet. I just saved the file, turned off the lights, and went to sleep. For the first time in months, I didn't dream about being called a loser. I dreamt of building again. By the end of that month, I had filed the first step of my legal petition to reclaim intellectual ownership of Bookmint's founding framework. It didn't go viral. There were no headlines. Just a quiet confirmation from Yvette that the filing had been processed and acknowledged. It wasn't a lawsuit, at least not yet. But it placed my name officially back into the public record as a co-developer of the platform that Franklin's empire had absorbed. It was a footnote now maybe, but I knew what footnotes could do when someone bothered to read them. They changed the meaning of the entire story. Franklin didn't respond. Not to the filing, not to the press mention. Not even to the letter I had written directly to him, in which I stated calmly and professionally that I was not asking for a relationship recognition or apology, but that he would no longer be allowed to build his legacy using the platters-hindered plastic foundation I had created without consequence. It wasn't written out of spite. It was written like a boundary, clear and unshakable. If he read it, he didn't reply. But I know he read it. Because the following week, his office issued a revised internal memo updating the development credits on the Next Chapter platform, quietly adding a line about independent strategy models built on external innovation. No names were included, but they didn't have to be. It was around that time that my sister Clara reached out. We hadn't spoken in over a year. Not because we fought, but because we had learned to orbit each other carefully like planets with incompatible atmospheres. Her message was short. "Can we talk?" That was all it said. I agreed to a video call, not knowing what she wanted, half expecting a lecture disguised as concern. But when her face appeared on the screen, she looked different. Softer, maybe. Or just less rehearsed. She didn't waste time. She said she had read the article. That it had made her sick. Not because it was surprising, but because she realized how long she had accepted a version of events that always left me out. She admitted she had believed what Franklin told them, that Bookman had floundered, that I had been overwhelmed, that he had rescued it, that I had let it go. I didn't interrupt, I just let her speak. And then she said something I didn't expect to hear from anyone in that family. She said, "I think I always knew he was harder on you. I just didn't want to look too closely at why." I didn't forgive her immediately, but I told her the truth. About Adrian, about the letter, about the night of the gala. She didn't cry, but her eyes turned glassy. And then she whispered almost to herself, "He punished you for not being his, and we all let it happen." There was nothing to say to that, so I didn't try. I just nodded. Because it was the first honest sentence I'd heard from that side of the family in a very long time. A week later, a box arrived at my door. No note, no return address, just a small square package sealed with black tape. Inside it was the fountain pen I had meant to give Franklin at the reunion. The monogrammed one. The gift I had left behind on the rooftop table after he made the toast. I hadn't asked for it back. I assumed it had been tossed or forgotten. But here it was returned to me without explanation. I didn't cry. I didn't overanalyze. I just placed it on my bookshelf beside the framed photo of the first Bookmint team taken the night we hit 10,000 users. It didn't mean everything was fixed. It didn't mean anyone was sorry. But it did mean someone was watching. Someone remembered. And maybe, just maybe, someone had started to see me. That small shift gave me permission to move forward. Not to fight harder, but to build differently. I started drafting the framework for a new platform. One focused on writers from underrepresented communities. Not a publishing house, but a digital space where authors could retain control of their work, their name, their story. I called it Framelight, because sometimes all a voice needs is a little space and the right structure to shine. I didn't announce it publicly. Not yet. I wanted to build it quietly, with care, without ego. The way I wished I had been allowed to build things the first time around. I worked late most nights, but this time the exhaustion didn't feel heavy. It felt earned. My name sat at the top of every file, every plan, every piece of code. I wasn't hiding anymore. I wasn't waiting for permission to exist. And that, more than any lawsuit or reunion speech, was what finally made me feel free. By early spring, Framelight was fully in motion. I hadn't posted anything public, but word was spreading through the right people in quiet spaces. I'd built a small team of editors and tech developers, almost all of them women or people who'd left corporate publishing after being overlooked or overruled one too many times. Our pitch wasn't flashy. We didn't promise fame or viral numbers. What we promised was control. Writers kept their rights. They chose their own release schedule. We provided design tools, editorial support, and a platform that didn't penalize their stories for not sounding like what sold last year. It was slow work, sometimes exhausting, but it never felt like I was erasing myself to belong. I didn't tell anyone in my family what I was building, not out of pettiness, just protection. I had learned the difference between privacy and secrecy. Secrecy makes you shrink, privacy lets you breathe. And after years of shrinking to fit into rooms where my name was treated like an inconvenience, I wasn't about to give away my peace again. Still, the past has a way of circling back. And one afternoon it did when my brother David sent me an email with a subject line that just read coffee. I stared at it for 10 minutes before opening it. The message was 3 sentences. He said he'd be in Seattle for a real estate event. He said he wouldn't bring up the past if I didn't want him to. And he said if I was willing to meet, he'd be grateful. I didn't owe him anything, but I was curious. David and I had grown up with the same last name under the same roof, but somehow, we'd never actually met each other as adults. He had always been the golden boy, the polished heir who understood how to navigate Franklin's world like he was born for it. Maybe he was, maybe that was the difference, but part of me wanted to hear what he thought he had to say. We met at a quiet cafe near the water. He was already sitting when I arrived, staring out the window like someone who wasn't used to waiting. When he saw me, he stood up quickly, awkwardly, like he'd rehearsed a different kind of greeting but forgot what to do. He didn't mention the reunion, didn't mention the paternity, didn't mention the articles. Instead, he asked how I was sleeping. The question caught me off guard. I told him I was doing fine. Then I asked what he wanted. David took a breath. Then he told me that after the gala, after the credits were updated, after the press began to shift, he started paying closer attention to the internal numbers. Apparently, the new platform wasn't growing as quickly as projected. User retention was flat. Reader satisfaction was mixed. The tech was solid, but something was missing. It's like they don't trust us, he said. And maybe they shouldn't. Then he looked at me and said I didn't see it before. But Bookmint had something different. It felt like someone was listening. I think that was you. He wasn't asking for help. That much was clear. He was just trying to say what he hadn't been able to say before. That maybe I hadn't failed. That maybe in some quiet way I had built something that mattered. I didn't respond right away. I just sipped my coffee and let the moment sit between us. Then, I asked him one question. Do you believe Franklin would ever admit that David looked away, smiled the kind of sad smile you give when the answer is obvious, and said, not out loud, not ever. That was enough for me. I didn't need more. We parted on polite terms. He didn't ask to see the new platform. I didn't offer. But something about that meeting closed a door I hadn't realized was still cracked open. I walked back to my office lighter than I'd felt in weeks. Not because I had proved anything to him, but because I no longer needed to. That was the moment I knew I was no longer reacting to my family. I was finally building on my own terms. Later that evening, I stood in the studio as we onboarded our first cohort of writers. One woman had been turned away by 5 publishers because her story was too niche. Another was a single mom from Detroit who wrote thrillers at night after her kids went to sleep. Each person had a voice that didn't sound like anyone else's, and they weren't asking for permission anymore. They were asking for space, for structure, for light. And for the first time, I could give them that. By the time summer came, Framelight had launched quietly and was growing faster than I expected. We weren't being covered by major tech outlets or featured in flashy panels, but our writers were getting paid, retaining control of their work, and publishing with dignity. That was enough. The email that changed everything came on a Thursday afternoon. It wasn't from a journalist or investor. It was from a junior editor at Franklin's company, someone I had never met. Her message was cautious. She said she had recently resigned, and that things inside the company were unraveling faster than the outside world realized. She offered to share internal memos and reports if I wanted them, not for revenge, she said, but because I had a right to know how the story was turning. I didn't respond immediately. I forwarded the message to Yvette, who verified it and scheduled a quiet meeting. The former editor's name was Hannah, and she brought with her a stack of internal communications that painted a clear picture. Franklin's new digital division was underperforming. Investor confidence was shaky. Several authors had requested their rights be returned after discovering how closely the new platform resembled Bookmint, down to language that had been lifted from my original copy. There were emails from PR trying to decide how to contain the narrative if I were to speak publicly. But what caught my eye was a thread between Franklin and 2 board members dated 3 weeks after my legal filing. He had written, "We underestimated hair. Quiet doesn't mean weak." That line stopped me. Not because it was insulting, but because it confirmed what I had always suspected. My silence had never been respected. It had only been convenient for those who wanted to take more without challenge. Franklin had counted on me staying quiet, staying ashamed, staying small. And now that I had done none of those things, he didn't know how to recalibrate. That wasn't victory, but it was truth. And it gave me something I didn't know I needed. That week I received a formal settlement offer through Franklin's legal team. It wasn't an apology, it was a check. A substantial one intended to resolve any lingering disputes regarding authorship and legacy. I let the envelope sit on my desk for 2 days before touching it. When I finally opened it, I didn't react the way I thought I would. I didn't feel validated, I didn't feel rage. I felt something closer to confirmation. They weren't paying for silence. They were paying because they knew they had been seen. I turned down the settlement, not because the money didn't matter, but because the terms included a non-disclosure agreement. I wasn't interested in telling my story for drama, but I wasn't willing to erase it again. I sent back a letter written plainly, and with the same professional tone I had used my entire career. I thanked them for the offer. I declined it. I wished them clarity moving forward. Yvette said she had rarely seen a response land with so much impact. Not because it was loud, but because it was exact. There was no confusion left about where I stood. I didn't announce any of this. I just kept working. Clara sent me a message the following week, telling me she had stepped away from the family's social outreach foundation and was starting something on her own. She didn't ask for help, just said she finally understood why I needed to walk away. It didn't fix our history, but it shifted something. David forwarded me a press release from an industry outlet mentioning Framelight by name, then texted me one word: impressive. Again, I didn't reply. Not because I was holding a grudge. I just wasn't building this for them. One night, I went back to the rooftop where the family reunion had happened, not as a statement, just as closure. I stood in the same place I had walked away from months earlier, looked out over the city, and realized something strange. I didn't feel small anymore. I didn't feel like the girl who got left out of the toast. I felt like the woman who had built something lasting without needing to be celebrated for it. The fountain pen was still in my bag, a quiet reminder of what I had once tried to offer in exchange for approval. Now it stayed with me not as a symbol of loss, but as proof of what I had reclaimed. 2 months after I turned down the settlement, Framelight crossed its first major milestone. Over 100 writers had launched projects through the platform, and more than half had already hit their personal sales goals. The feedback wasn't just about money. It was about ownership, clarity, and feeling like their stories weren't filtered through someone else's idea of what was marketable. I watched the numbers grow each week, not with pride in the metrics, but with a quiet recognition that I had built something real, something rooted in value instead of validation. It didn't fix the years I'd lost, but it redefined what those years had taught me. The media eventually caught up. One article in particular asked a simple question in its headline: what happens when the discarded founder builds a better house? It was framed as a comparison between Framelight's quiet growth and Franklin's platform's recent internal restructuring. The piece didn't attack anyone. It didn't mention the paternity revelations or the reunion toast. But it made one thing clear: the market was noticing that integrity wasn't just a moral stance. It was a design advantage. When you let creators lead with their own voice, you didn't need to manufacture authenticity. It showed up naturally. I didn't repost the article. I didn't call anyone to celebrate, but I printed a copy and slid it into the same file folder where I kept the original Bookmint launch pitch. Not because I needed proof of anything, but because I wanted a complete record. A reminder that beginnings could be taken, but legacy was earned. Around that same time, my mother called again. This time she left a message. Her voice was quieter than I remembered. She said she had been thinking a lot. That she hadn't known how to say anything before because she hadn't known what to say, and that if I ever wanted to talk just the two of us, she would be in Chicago through the end of the week. I flew back 2 days later, not for confrontation, not for closure, just for truth. We met in the garden of the house I had grown up in, surrounded by the same hydrangeas she used to trim when Franklin had guests over. She wore the same perfume, spoke the same way, but there was something less rehearsed in her posture. Like the performance had cracked, and she was learning how to stand without it. She told me about Adrian, about the summer before she met Franklin, about the way the family pressure had come down fast and sharp. She said Franklin had offered safety, and that for a long time she believed that was enough. I listened not with anger, but with a strange calm. Because none of it surprised me. What did surprise me was when she said she kept the birth certificate unsigned because a part of her had hoped someday I would ask. That she had wanted me to know even if she had been too afraid to be the one to say it. Then she asked me what I wanted now, and for the first time in my life I didn't stumble. I told her I didn't need an apology. I just needed honesty moving forward. No more half-truths. No more silence dressed up as protection. She nodded. Then she reached into her pocket and handed me a small velvet pouch. Inside was a ring I hadn't seen since childhood. A thin gold band with a tiny aquamarine stone. She said it was hers from when she was 17 before anything in her life had been chosen for her. She said it didn't fix anything, but it was something that was truly hers. And now it could be mine. I didn't cry. I didn't promise to call more often. But when I stood to leave, I hugged her first, and I held on a little longer than I thought I would. That night I walked alone past the office building where Franklin's company was headquartered. It looked exactly the same. Polished glass, white marble pillars, perfect lighting, but it didn't feel the same. Not because it had changed, but because I had. There was nothing left in that building that I needed. Not acknowledgement, not redemption, not even revenge. The things I had spent so long chasing no longer held weight, because now I knew who I was without them. And more importantly, I knew who I was when no one was looking. In the months that followed, Framelight continued to grow slowly but solidly, like something being built not for attention but for longevity. We didn't go viral, we didn't land splashy investments. But the writers stayed. They published, they earned, and most importantly, they owned what they created. Watching that unfold felt more fulfilling than any award or feature ever had. Because it wasn't just a platform. It was proof that what they told me I wasn't capable of had already been done, and not just once. Twice. The first time they took it, the second time I kept it. I still got invitations, industry panels, networking brunches, even a few from organizations that had once declined my proposals, but now wanted me to share my experience as a woman in leadership. I declined most of them. Not out of pride, but because I had no interest in being the headline in someone else's redemption arc. I wasn't looking to be the symbol of anything. I just wanted the work to speak without interruption. But one invitation caught my attention. It came from a small university in Massachusetts, the same one where Franklin had donated to a new media lab years ago. The department head said they were hosting a roundtable on independent publishing models and asked if I'd be willing to speak not as a token but as someone who had changed the conversation. I didn't say yes right away. But something in me recognized that this wasn't about the room. It was about who I'd be when I walked into it. I flew in the night before and stayed in a modest hotel off campus. No press, no family, just me. The auditorium wasn't large. Maybe 70 people. Grad students, professors, a few local journalists. I spoke for 20 minutes. Nothing rehearsed. No slide deck. I just told the truth. About what it meant to be erased then to come back anyway. About how integrity wasn't just a personal value but a business model. And about the strange relief that comes when you stop trying to win someone else's definition of success. There was a short pause after I finished. Then a young man in the front row raised his hand and asked, "What would you tell someone who's just starting out and already being told they're not enough?" I didn't pause. I said, don't spend your best years trying to impress people who need you to shrink in order to feel large. Afterward, a student came up to me quietly and said her older sister had been one of the early Bookmint users. She said her sister still kept the first version of her published story in print because it was the first time someone had told her that her voice mattered. I nodded. I didn't need to say anything else. Because that was the point. Not the lawsuits, not the platform launches, not the headlines. The real victory was that someone somewhere kept writing because something I helped build told them they could. And that meant more than any public win ever would. Back in Seattle, the office felt different. Lighter, maybe. I started noticing the way the new interns looked at me, not with fear or performance, but with interest. They asked real questions. They offered honest ideas, and I realized I was now doing for them what no one had done for me. Making space, protecting clarity, keeping the noise out. I still worked late some nights. But I no longer worked from hunger. Now I worked from direction, from peace. From a place where I didn't need to prove anything to anyone except the person I saw in the mirror. Then one afternoon I opened my inbox and saw an unfamiliar address. It was from Adrian. He said he had just read the article about frame light and recognized the way I described our writers how I wrote about permission and self-ownership. He said it reminded him of something he once believed in before life got quiet and practical. Then he said he hoped I knew that what I had created wasn't just impressive, it was restorative. That word stayed with me. Not powerful, not brilliant, restorative. Like something that made other people whole again. That night, I wrote my first essay in a long time, under my own name. No alias, no ghostwriting, just my name typed at the top. It wasn't a takedown, it wasn't a confession. It was a simple piece about what it means to reclaim what's yours, without needing revenge to fuel the fire. I closed it with a sentence that surprised me, even as I typed it. The people who tried to silence me taught me how to speak without fear. That might be their greatest mistake. A year after the family reunion, I received another invitation. It was handwritten not from Franklin, but from his assistant. A formal dinner in his honor for receiving a Lifetime Achievement Award in the publishing industry. It wasn't clear if I had been invited as an olive branch or as a calculated move to show the world that the family was still united, still intact. I stared at the envelope for a long time before deciding to go. Not because I needed closure, and certainly not because I had anything to prove, but because I wanted to see with my own eyes how much I had outgrown the weight they once placed on me. The event was held at a historic hotel in Chicago, with floor-to-ceiling windows and white-gloved servers gliding between crystal centerpieces. The crowd was polished, powerful, predictable. As I stepped into the room, there was a pause. Not loud, not theatrical. Just enough silence to register surprise. I didn't shrink. I didn't scan for approval. I simply walked to the table with my nameplate, sat down, and smiled. It was a quiet kind of triumph, the kind that doesn't demand attention but earns it anyway. Franklin stood at the podium 40 minutes and rehearsed as always. He thanked colleagues, clients, mentors. He didn't mention family. Not until the very end, when he scanned the room, made eye contact with me for a beat too long, and said, "I'm proud of the legacy we've built together, even when the journey was complicated." It was subtle. A line designed to sanitize the past. To make the years he ignored me sound like a creative disagreement. I didn't flinch. I didn't nod. I just let the words hang where they belonged, between us, unfinished. After this speech, a woman I didn't know approached me quietly. She introduced herself as one of the early investors in Bookmint. She said she had always wondered what really happened, but reading about Framelight gave her the answer. Then she handed me a business card and said, "Whatever you build next, call me." I slipped the card into my clutch without promise or pretense, because I knew now that the next thing I built wouldn't be born from anger. It would be born from clarity, from ownership, from peace. Before I left, I stopped by the dessert table where Franklin stood talking to two board members. He turned as I approached, expression tight but composed. I looked him in the eye and said, "Congratulations. You always did love a spotlight." His smile didn't falter, but his grip on the champagne glass shifted slightly. I didn't wait for a reply. I turned, walked out the door, and didn't look back. Not because it was dramatic, but because there was nothing left in that room for me to retrieve. Outside, the air was cold, clean, real. I pulled my coat tighter and called a car, not to go home but to the small co-working space where I now mentored first-time creators every other weekend. We didn't have big budgets or marble floors, but we had something rarer. We had truth. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. Later that night, I sat alone at my kitchen table and reread the final paragraph of the essay I had published under my real name. It read, "Sometimes the loudest victories are the ones no one claps for. The ones where you quietly return to yourself and realize you were never the problem. You were just too honest for a room full of people who needed lies to feel safe." I closed the laptop, turned out the light, and exhaled. Because this wasn't about revenge. It never was. It was about returning to a place they told me I didn't belong, and realizing I had built something better, not despite their rejection but because of it. And the version of me who once cried in a locked bathroom after being called a failure was long gone. In her place was someone who didn't need applause to feel worthy, just silence and the strength to stand in it. So now I ask you, the one still watching this far, in what part of your story are you letting someone else narrate for you, and are you ready to take the pen back?